Hi, Social Psych class. It's been a while since we talked about Chapter 7, so this is a brief video just to remind you of what we did before break regarding Chapter 7 to prepare you for the quiz. So, remember that we were talking about social influence, conformity, obedience, compliance, and social roles. We talked about how conformity and social roles are considered implicit expectations because they're just kind of understood without having to be written down or put into exact words, whereas compliance and obedience are when you respond to a direct request or order from somebody. So then we also talked about social norms being these sort of unwritten rules for how we all act in social behaviors, situations. We talked about just doing what other people around you are doing without really thinking about it. It's called a herd mentality. And then we also talked about social contagion, which is the idea that ideas kind of distribute themselves among society. So a more recent example of that is the idea that we all need to stock up on toilet paper and hoard things like meat and soup. Went to Walmart yesterday and they were out of ramen noodles. So the idea that we should do that is an example of social contagion, the sort of panic or beliefs that go out in a society. We also talked about mass psychogenic illnesses, and two examples that we discussed were the laughing epidemic that happened in Tanzania in Africa a few years ago, and then we also talked about lycanthropy, which is when people in the Middle Ages thought that they were werewolves. So a psychological explanation for that is this mass psychogenic illness where it spreads among a village. Remember also that I talked about a potential biological reason for the Salem witch trials, at least, which were the idea that people were eating moldy rye bread, which had become a hallucinogen. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, so implicit rules are when we follow these unspoken rules. And so we talked about like how to act in a men's bathroom. And there are two types of implicit social influences. Informational social influence, if you remember, is doing something because you think it's the right thing to do, versus normative social influence, which is doing something to fit in or be accepted by society. Okay, so we talked about two examples. The Sharif study of conformity was an example of informational social influence. And hopefully you remember this talked about the autokinetic effect, which is when you go into a dark room and you see a stationary light and it appears to move even though it's not moving. So Sharif brought in people one at a time. P's is always participants, remember, and they guessed about 4 inches of motion. That was the control group. Then he brought in people and they were in groups and they heard a Confederate in the group guess either 15 inches of motion or 2 inches of motion, and their own guesses then conformed to what the Confederate had said. So it was kind of like an anchor and adjust situation for them. So the participants' guesses matched what the Confederate had said, even though no one had asked them to do that. That's why it's informational social influence and also implicit social influence. Okay, an example of normative social influence, doing something just to kind of fit in, is the famous Ash line judgment study. So he brings in people and they're in a big group and he asks them, guess the line A, B, or C that matches the target line. And remember that people were tested in groups and everybody else in the group was a Confederate and they all said the wrong line. And many of the participants in that study went along with the wrong guess. And it wasn't because they actually thought it was correct. It was because they wanted to fit in. They felt weird not saying the right answer, even though they knew objectively that it was probably the wrong answer. So that's why it's normative social influence. So again, when the Confederates chose the wrong line, the participants did that. It wasn't all the time. It was about a third of the time that they did it, and about 75% of the participants did it at least once. And again, during debriefing, they said it was because they just were giving into peer pressure. So that's what makes it the normative social influence. They did it to fit in. Okay, final thing we talked about before break was the replication of the Ash studies. Ash did these himself, and he found that conformity increased when the size of the majority increased, so the number of Confederates were there. When we talked about conformity went up when the length of the lines was closer to each other, so it was kind of harder to tell which line was correct. When the majority was somebody's in-group, so if I'm a woman, other women in the group will make me more likely to conform because they're my in-group. But he also found that women in general are more likely to conform, which bums me out as a woman. So that's what we talked about before break. I'm going to make another video talking about what we were about to discuss. And that way you'll get all of Chapter 7. You'll be ready for the Chapter 7 quiz. Let me know if you have any questions.